In a small, remote village, people's lives are extremely difficult. The land is barren, there is not enough rice to grow crops, hunger always lurks in every family in the village. In that village, there is a small family of Min, 26 years old, living with his beautiful wife named Vai, 22 years old, and his little sister, Maly, only 16 years old. The three of them take care of each other, overcome difficult days with not enough food, always rely on each other to survive. Min is a simple, honest man, always trying to work hard to take care of his wife and sister. He loves Vai deeply and always gives Maly the care of an older brother. To him, family is everything. Despite hardship, he always smiles, encouraging everyone to overcome difficulties. However, in the poverty and the mixed feelings of brotherhood and love, a rift quietly appeared in that small family. Little sister Maly gradually grew up and realized strange feelings for her brother-in-law Min. At first, she just thought it was her sister's admiration for her hardworking, kind brother-in-law. But gradually, when hunger and deprivation not only wore out her body but also disturbed her mind, those feelings gradually became more complicated. One day, while Vai went to the market to find some food for the family, Min and Maly stayed at home. In the midst of poverty, in the midst of burdens, Maly found comfort in her brother-in-law. The comforting words, the gentle look suddenly became strange, full of affection. Maly could not contain her emotions, and did not expect that, in that moment, Min also let her heart overcome her mind. That day, the weather suddenly turned rainy. Vai had to go to work across a stream, which was already difficult to walk on, but now it was even more slippery and dangerous when the water level rose. Before leaving, Vai turned back to look at Min and Maly, telling them she would return early. But the rain continued to pour down all afternoon, making the way back more difficult than ever. At home, Min and Maly stood by the window, watching the pouring rain outside. The rains this season often lasted for a long time. The sky was so gloomy that everything became heavy, like a curtain covering the small village. Maly couldn't help but worry, her eyes looking towards the path leading to the stream. But Min didn't show much emotion, just stood there quietly looking outside, his eyes strangely calm. The rain gradually stopped, but Vai's figure was still nowhere to be seen. Night began to fall, the cold crept throughout the simple wooden house. Maly looked at Min, worriedly asking, "Brother, why hasn't Vai come back yet? It's getting dark." But instead of answering, Min just turned his head slightly to look at her. His eyes were thoughtful, sparkling in the darkness with a puzzled look. Min was silent, not a word of comfort or worry for his wife who was lost in the dark. Instead, his eyes seemed to be fixed on Maly, the little sister standing in front of him. There was something unclear but intense in those eyes, an emotion that Maly had felt before, but never dared to admit. The raindrops still lingering on the eaves fell, their rhythm as steady as Maly's frantic heartbeat. She felt her breathing become heavy, confused by Min's gaze. The later the night, the colder it got, making the two of them seem closer together in the small house. Maly did not dare to look into Min's eyes, but did not want to leave him either. In the quiet space, Maly let out a soft sigh, trying to control the pounding of her heart in her chest. She knew that there was a thin boundary between the two of them, an invisible string that bound them together in the irony of fate. But that night, when the two of them stood in the flickering light, the coldness of the night seemed to push them, challenging them to touch the emotions that had been buried for so long. Time passed, life in the poor village continued with hungry days, cold nights in the small house. Vai still worked hard to help her family. She did not know that inside the house that she always thought was a safe shelter, a silent fire was creeping between her husband and her sister. That night, Vai returned after a hard day's work. Her steps were tired because she had to walk a long distance in the bitter cold. That day, the cold wind blew in, making her body shiver. Each gust of wind seemed to cut into her skin. She did not have enough warm clothes, poverty made everything seem lacking. When she entered the house, she saw Min and Maly sitting by the fire. Both of them seemed silent but exuded a strange atmosphere that she could not name. Vi saw Min, his eyes looked at her calmly as usual, but she couldn't realize that his gaze had changed, was no longer as simple as before. She saw something faint in his eyes, but in her own fatigue, she ignored all the doubts that flashed through her mind. You and Maly are sitting here so warmly, I'm shivering all over. Vi said, smiling tiredly. Min stood up, got her a thin blanket, but his eyes quickly glanced at Maly. That glance was short but enough for Maly to notice. She blushed slightly, lowered her head, as if hiding something, while Vi had no idea about the complexity intertwined in the house. In private moments, Min had unintentionally let his heart wander, and his eyes had often secretly glanced at Maly, not as an older brother taking care of his younger sister, but with a gaze filled with forbidden emotions. Every time Maly walked by, his eyes followed every line on her body. Her innocent movements made him confused and torn inside. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself from being attracted. Maly, although still immature, was not completely heartless. There were moments when she felt Min's eyes following her, but in the innocence of youth, she couldn't understand everything that was going on in her brother-in-law's heart. She still trusted him, the brother-in-law she always saw as a respectable and safe older brother. That night, the three of them sat down to eat a simple meal together. Vi laughed and talked happily, trying to maintain a warm family atmosphere to dispel the cold of the winter night. But in the hearts of Min and Maly, another fire was still smoldering, making the atmosphere suffocating even though they did not admit it. From that silent and stifling night, time passed, everything seemed to return to normal, but inside, the heavy and torn feelings still did not subside. Min and Maly, Vi's younger sister, still lived under the same roof, but each person had their own worries in their hearts. That day, the weather was colder than usual. After a night of heavy rain, the cold wind blew through the cracks in the door. The cold seemed to penetrate deep into every fiber of the flesh. Maly caught a cold, her body was weak and trembling, her face was pale. Vi was worried about her sister, decided to go to the faraway market to buy medicine, leaving Min and Maly at home. In the small, quiet house, only Maly was left lying on the bed, her eyes closed, her breathing weak. Min entered the room, his eyes flashed with worry when he saw Maly in this state. Outside, the weather was getting colder and colder, but inside, another emotion crept into his heart, weakness and conflict between reason and heart. Maly moved slightly, her eyes opened, and she saw Min standing there. Her voice was weak and hoarse, "On Min. I'm thirsty. Can you get me a glass of water?" Min nodded, and quickly went to get water for Maly. He poured a glass of warm water, then sat down next to the bed, gently bringing the glass to her. His hand touched hers, a warm but strange feeling spread in that moment. Maly's eyes looked up, meeting Min's eyes. In that look, there was something shy, mixed with embarrassment, but also something that could not be said. "You drink, Maly. I will stay here to take care of you until Vi comes back," Min said, his voice gentle. Maly smiled slightly, but it was a smile mixed with confusion. She took sips of water, her hands still unconsciously holding Min's. The two of them fell into a quiet space, as if there was no one else but them. Min felt her heart beat faster, as if she was caught up in an intense and enchanting emotion. Time seemed to stop in the small room. Neither of them dared to speak of their hidden feelings, but that silence contained more than words could express. In that brief moment, both of them understood that they were crossing the boundary of brotherhood, the boundary of morality that they were supposed to maintain. Outside, the weather was still cold. Maly leaned her head on Min's shoulder, feeling his warmth and safety. The two of them sat next to each other, silent but also full of confusion. That light touch was an unspoken word, an unspoken confession. After that moment, Maly could never imagine that Min, the brother-in-law she once respected, would dare to cross the boundary between them. The moment he accidentally touched a sensitive part of her body, Maly was stunned, her heart pounded and confusion filled her. She did not know how to face him, but deep inside, that complicated feeling made her both confused and a little curious. Time passed, Vi returned home, tired after a long day, and tried to find medicine for her sister. When she entered the house, she saw Maly sitting by the bed, smiling awkwardly without saying anything. She approached Maly, gently asking about her sister's condition, but Maly only responded with a weak whisper. In Vi's eyes, it was just her sister's fatigue due to illness, but she didn't know that behind that smile was a storm of emotions that Maly was hiding. Min watched his wife take care of Maly, but in his heart, another fire was burning, the fire of temptation, the struggle between conflicting emotions and family responsibility. From that day on, his heart was divided in two. One side was the love for Vi, the wife he once loved, and the other side was the uncontrollable desire for Maly, the innocent and fragile sister. Every night, when lying next to Vi, he couldn't stop thinking about Maly. Images of the intimate moments with Maly kept appearing in his mind, urging him, tearing him apart and making him unable to find peace. He knew that he was wrong, knew that he was falling into a spiral of sin, but that fire still couldn't be extinguished. Every time he met Maly again, Min's eyes were no longer those of an older brother. That gaze was full of possessiveness, desire, and darkness, something that Maly could not fully understand but could not deny. She felt confused and embarrassed by his eyes, but could not leave him, because in her heart she was also nurturing unspeakable emotions. From that day on, in the small house, the atmosphere became more stifling and tense than ever. Vi was still innocently unaware, still loving and trusting her husband, taking care of her younger sister with all her love and trust. She did not realize that there was an invisible change creeping into her family, a dark fire silently burning everything. Time passed. Min, Vi, and Maly's lives continued peacefully, but the smoldering fire of conflicting emotions between Min and Maly grew stronger, pushing the small family into an emotional storm. Vi did not know what was happening, still going to work with her husband every day on the familiar road, crossing the small stream. They worked hard to make a living together, but her trust in Min remained strong. One day, on the way home, Min suddenly complained of a stomach ache, his face pale and tired. He told Vi that it was probably due to not eating for many days that his stomach hurt. Feeling sorry for her husband, Vi immediately told him to go home and rest first, while she would continue to work to earn some money to buy medicine and food. Min returned to his small house, his heart both relieved and restless. He knew that Maly was waiting for him at home, and the thought urged him like an irresistible fascination. When he entered the house, he saw Maly sitting by the window, her eyes dreamily looking out, her face still a bit sad and weak from illness. Min's gaze towards Maly changed, no longer the gentle gaze of an older brother, but a gaze full of possessiveness and passion. He slowly approached, constantly looking at Maly. Maly was slightly startled when she saw Min return early, her eyes clearly showing surprise mixed with a bit of shyness. She lowered her head, not daring to look straight into his eyes, but a strange feeling stirred in her heart. Maly, are you feeling better? Min asked, his voice gentle but somewhat profound. Maly just nodded slightly, saying nothing. The atmosphere between them became heavy, only the sound of cold wind whistling through the crack in the door. Min could no longer control his emotions. He sat down next to Maly, his hand gently touching her shoulder, his eyes staring at her. Maly. There are things I can't say, but, my heart, it no longer listens to reason, Min whispered, his voice trembling, filled with conflict. Maly felt her heart beating erratically, the emotions in her heart became conflicted and confused. She knew that this was wrong, but her weakness and hidden feelings made her unable to break away. Komin's eyes looked at her passionately, his hands gently caressed her hair, as if to comfort her but also as a tacit confession of his heart. Both of them seemed to be caught in a vortex that neither could escape. In that moment, Maly no longer had the strength to refuse, nor the reason to stop. They looked at each other in silence, but that look said everything that both of them were hiding. For a moment, Maly felt a sense of safety and warmth from Komin, whom she had always considered a spiritual support. But in that safety, she also realized dangerous emotions, like an underground fire burning slowly, threatening to destroy everything. From that fateful moment, the relationship between Komin and Maly had crossed the line that both of them knew they should not touch. Every time they met, their eyes were filled with hidden desire, like two smoldering fires waiting to burst into flames when no one was watching. Amidst the poverty and quiet atmosphere of the village, that taboo feeling grew even more in secret and torment. They did not dare to openly express their feelings, but every look, every gesture contained unspoken words. Every time Vivi turned away or stepped outside, Komin and Maly only needed a glance to understand each other's thoughts, as if they were living in a separate world, where only they had intense emotions. Even though they knew that this was wrong, both of them could not stop themselves. This feeling was like an underground stream that quietly seeped in, breaking down little by little the barriers that morality and reason had built. But they did not realize that this feeling was like a fire that was burning everything, not only between them but also this small family.